entries in Design Manager. And it looks like we do have a nice split between our Design Manager and Design Manager Professional users today. So I'll be going back and forth between the two platforms to show how the entries appear in each of the different platforms. But if you have a question or want more clarification on the entries on either DM or DM Pro, just type it in to the question box in the GoToMeeting, and Liz can bring it to my attention at one of our stopping points. So let's go ahead and begin. Today we're going to show how in Design Manager you can record your payroll entries, and there's really two methods to do so. You can use our payroll system where you can manually input all the payroll information for each of your employees and even generate your checks through Design Manager. Or secondly, you could use a third-party payroll and processing company such as Paychex or your accounting professional or even another payroll application, and then record that information directly into Design Manager. Before we get started though, I do want to say, and I'll say it a few times throughout the webinar today, is that Design Manager does not calculate payroll taxes, deductions, withholdings, or any of that information. We're a small specialized company focusing on the interior design business, and we don't have the resources of a Intuit that makes QuickBooks or even a payroll processing company that focuses solely on that information. So that information must either come from a third party or you must do the research yourself for your locality and get all of those deductions and withholding and taxes, etc., calculated yourself. Okay, that being said, let's begin. And as I said, there's really two ways to handle payroll entries in Design Manager. We can input the information ourselves through the Design Manager payroll system, or we can do the journal entries. And we'll begin today with the payroll entries. Now, the payroll entry is a specialized operating expense that's utilized only to record payroll information, and then we can even generate our checks through Design Manager's check processing system for your employees. This is an entirely manual method, okay? But it does alleviate the need of having a payroll processing company. It's just Paychex. But on the flip side, it does require the most initial configuration time, and it requires the most manual data entry for each payroll period. When processing payroll yourself, you're going to be recording the salary of the employees as a company expense. And you're also going to be recording all of the necessary withholdings for the federal, state, and local funds for each employee, which in turn you're going to need to pay to each of those particular tax authorities as expenses outside of the payroll processing for the employees themselves. So what do we need to do to get the payroll entry configured in Design Manager? Well, the first thing we need to do is to configure the proper accounts if they're not already done so. In Design Manager, our account glossary is under Glossaries and Accounts. While in our professional platform, you would go to your General Ledger drop-down and your account glossary. And you'll notice that the account glossary window between the two platforms is very, very similar. We'll use our Design Manager as our main example board today. So on our account glossary, we're going to need, first of all, of course, we'll need some sort of cash checking account that is configured so we can actually generate our checks at the end of the process, as my account 10,010 cash checking is configured here. We'll also need a salary expense account. This is going to be the account where we record all of the salaries for our employees as a business expense. We're also going to need a variety of withholding accounts. As we can see here, these are liability accounts, indicating that this is going to be activity that I'm going to have to pay someone else, in this case, each of the various tax authorities. And these will vary depending upon your locality. Everyone's going to have federal income tax withheld, and you're going to have FICA, Medicare, state income. Those can vary greatly between each locality. And you can see I have configured here several that we'll use as our examples. while that is being, while noting those, you'll notice very frequently in your accounts that you may have a FICA liability account, but you may also see FICA listed elsewhere in Design Manager's account glossary. Let's sort this by account name, and we'll drop down to our FICA, and we can see, well, here's our withholding account for FICA, but I also have an expense account. These expense accounts for our payroll taxes, and here they are, these are the expenses that the business accumulates just to have employees. So the business will actually owe this outside of the money we reduce off of our employees that we need to withhold and then repay the authorities. So those two are completely different. One is the business expense, as indicated by the 6,000 categories here, and we also have the withholding liability accounts, which are technically money from the client that from the employee that we're holding, and will be passing on to the authority. So be careful on the difference between those two, as it does get confusing. Now, back on our liability account, our withholding accounts here, let's edit our federal income tax. We'll notice that I have configured with a special payroll account option here. This is going to help us as we set up each of our employees for payroll generation, and even when we input additional payroll entries to pay the employee their salary. So it's very important that each of these withholding accounts and the salary account are set with the payroll account option as shown here. So the accounts we need some cash checking account, we need our withholding liability accounts depending on your locality, and we'll also need you also have the business expense accounts, which the business will pay separately from the payroll entries. So that's what we need to do and have pre-configured for our accounts in Design Manager. Now what's the next step of pre-configuration for our payroll entries? Well, that's going to have us configure the employees themselves. In Design Manager, the employees are under the glossaries drop-down and the employee manager salesperson glossary. In Professional, those are also under glossaries, employees, managers, salespeople. And again, you can see between the two platforms, the employee glossary window is very similar. So let's take a look at Ashley Brandon, our first employee listed here. I added her. We'll see our employee window, which has generally her contact information, notes and info, time billing information, but we're concerned with our payroll tab. And here, as you can see, I've already added some accounts for Ashley. Ashley is a salaried employee. It's the easier of the two options here in that she gets the same amount of money each pay period. So I can come in, I can add each of our payroll accounts with the appropriate salary and then the withholding distributions. The salary, as you can see, is a positive amount. That's her net amount that she's going to be paid. Each of the withholdings are going to reduce that amount. So they're entered as negatives, and they'll go into our liability accounts indicating to us that we do need to pay the authorities that money that we've withheld. So I've already added the salary, the federal income tax withheld, and the Medicare tax withheld. But let's say we had an additional withholding account. We can add one by clicking our plus sign here. And let's go ahead and add a state withholding. There we go. And we could say that the state will also take $50. And there we go. So we're configuring Ashley's employee glossary so that whenever we create our payroll entries, all this information will default for us so we don't have to enter it each time. Again, that's very, very convenient for the salaried employees because this information won't change unless, one, her salary changes, or two, any of the federal, state, or local taxes change. And a nice feature here is Design Manager won't let you add an account here if it's not configured as one of our payroll accounts with our payroll option. So what would happen is, let's say we inadvertently tried to add our FICA expense. Design Manager will warn us the account must be designated as a payroll account. So there's a very nice checks and balances in there. If the accounts are configured properly as payroll accounts, we're not going to be allowed to make mistakes adding the payroll accounts to our employee. So there we go. So this information is very handy when we actually create our payroll entries. Now, let's take a look at Patrick Wolf. In my example, Patrick is one of my hourly employees. So, unlike Ashley, I'm not going to pre-configure any information here. There's no reason to, because depending on how many hours Patrick works, the salary will change every time. The only benefit by having the accounts listed here is when I go to generate my payroll entry for Patrick, the accounts will already be there and I can fill in each of the information predicated on how many hours he does work. So let's take a look. Now that we've got our accounts configured, we also have our employees configured. Now we can begin to actually processing a payroll entry in Design Manager. Close down our employee glossary. In Design Manager, to create a payroll entry, we'd go to Documents and Accounting. We'd switch over to our vendor view. And here's a list of all of my vendors. But note that Ashley Brandon and Patrick Wolf have a different icon. They have an employee icon. That tells Design Manager that they're a specialized type of vendor. They're an employee vendor. In Professional, like all of our payables to be created, we'd go to our AP dropdown, select Vendor Invoices, and we'd add a new one for a payroll entry. Back in Design Manager, let's go ahead and create a new payroll entry for Ashley. To do so, we just click the Vendor Invoice button, and it automatically comes up to payroll entry with Ashley's name in the employee field. Now, we're going to need to enter some information into the period, which is generally the date range for which our payroll entry is going to be covering. And we could say, let's say it's the beginning of this year through the 15th. Okay. I have my check date. Now, pausing here, unlike a lot of payables in Design Manager, the check date on the specialized payroll entry will always be the date on the check. If we enter an operating expense, for example, it would say invoice date here, and that would be the date of the invoice itself, and my check date could be different. Payroll entries, the check date here is always going to print on the check, regardless of what I might type into when I print my check run, which I'll show as we get there. So we could say this was printed on the 15th. That defaults immediately to the due date. The transaction description is optional, but it could simply be, payroll. I have my pay with options. Generally, I'll be printing a check. It'd be very rare that I would use one of my liability accounts, but I could do so. We'll leave it as check, as that is the normal option. I also have the ability, and we can see, here are our accounts that we configured on our employee, and they automatically default to me. With Ashley, this is very simple because she's salary, and these won't change unless, again, her salary or other taxes change. But I might even need to add another withdrawal. Say there's like a quarterly liability tax that might occur, or a local services tax. We can add another one as needed. Local income tax might be a quarterly for $10. And there we go. So generally, she'll have the exact same set of salary and withholding accounts, but if we do need to add another one for some various tax that might occur throughout the year on an annual, quarterly, or biannual time frame, we can do so. Let's go ahead and click OK. And now we see we've created our payroll entry for Ashley. And now we have a check waiting to be paid on our checking window. So let's hop over there. Our checking window in Design Manager is on our Pay Bills and Checkbook button. And we can see our entry for Ashley. And on Professional, of course, we use our AP checking. And we'll have our checking window. Ashley would be listed right here. So, if we want to generate our final step for our payroll entry is to create the check for Ashley. And we would do so like any other vendor. Select, hit my check button. That brings me to my check run window. Of course, I have my cash account pre-configured. Now note, the checking date in the check run window always defaults to today's date. You can, of course, change that. But recall, as I said, when we do the payroll entries, those very specialized type of entries, it's always going to use our 1/15 date as shown here. So if we create our check, we can see Design Manager even has a specialized check stub format for payroll checks. Rather than listing all the vendor invoices or deposits or operating expenses for traditional vendors, we show our salary and all of our withholdings and our net pay. Notice up here, there's our date for our check, 1/15 and 1/15, even though I had 1/30 in the check date on the check run window. So that's very important to note. That's always the date of the payroll entry. And in this case, I'm using the middle check format, so I have my stub at the top, I have my check information, and I also have a second stub for Ashley herself at the bottom. And just like any other check, I would print this out onto my actual check document. I would close my print preview, and I would accept. So that's the process of using Design Manager's payroll entry system to generate physical checks to the employees. Again, there's much more configuration needed up front, and that we have to have all of our accounts configured, we have to have our employees configured to ease the data entry, and most importantly, we must have already gotten all of our necessary withholding percentages for federal, state, and local that can vary depending on your locality in the country. Okay, that gets us through the first method of handling payroll in Design Manager and brings us to a really nice stopping point before we continue. Liz, are there any questions out there that I should address before continuing?
Hey Brad, we've answered all the questions so far, so it looks like we're good right now.
Fantastic, that's great news, so let's keep going. Okay, so now the other option in Design Manager of recording the payroll is via journal entries. And we would use this method when we do have an outside or third-party source that's actually generating the paychecks for our employees. And that could be your accounting professional. A lot of account firms do this. You might use Paychecks, which is Design Manager's preferred accounting partner, or even a third-party accounting program that prints the checks, and you need to record that information into Design Manager. Now, a journal entry is a manual manipulation of the accounts. Unlike when we add a cash receipt through the cash receipt windows, or we make a client invoice and we automatically affect the accounts that are necessary for those various transactions, journal entries just manipulate the amounts in the accounts. Basically, we're just changing the amounts as necessary to reflect what happened in reality. With that being said, I'm going to assume that we know how to make a journal entry. We might not know our debits and credits like the back of our hand, but if we do need help on making, actually creating a journal entry in Design Manager or Design Manager Professional, we could do so at the end. I'll be happy to walk through a sample or two. But for our discussion on payroll, I've already pre-configured both of the platforms with some journal entries that I put in so we can review the different processes. Okay, so when using the journal entry method in Design Manager, we'd go to our Documents in Accounting, we'd switch our documents in accounting view to journal entries and miscellaneous cash receipts. And all of our existing journal entries are stored within our appropriate folders. In the professional platform, our existing journal entries are located off of our general ledger dropdown, journal entries, and our existing tab. And you can see that I've configured both of the platforms to have the same journal entries. Let's go back to our standard for our discussion. Now, there are several methods to entering the journal entries. We can do one journal entry for each employee using all of our expense accounts. We can do one journal entry for each employee using a unified expense account for our taxes, or we can do a single journal entry to handle all of the employees with a single expense account. Just like using the payroll system, we do of course have to have some accounts set up. Just to review, of course, we need some sort of cash checking account, some sort of banking institution account from which the funds are withdrawn. We're also going to need, again, our salaries account, which reflects how much we actually paid all of the employees. We're going to need our expense accounts in this case, because there are no withholdings when you're recording the journal entry. Well, why is that? The withholding and the paying of the necessary federal, state, and local authorities is done by the third-party payroll company. They've already taken the amount from each employee and handled, or at least theoretically handled, the paying of all of the authorities. So Design Manager does not need to use those withholding accounts at all. All we need to do is record the expenses necessary for the business of having employees, which are expense accounts, as I discussed earlier on. And lastly, besides the expense accounts for all of the taxes, in certain cases, if your company has a 401k plan and you do some matching for your employees as a benefit, you would also need that as a separate account. So we need our cash checking account, we need our salaries account, expense, we need the appropriate business payroll expense accounts, and if your company does so, you would need a 401k expense as well. So let's take a look at our three options of journal entry input. The first I described was where we make a single journal entry for each of our employees. And moreover, we actually affect each one of our payroll tax expense accounts individually. So I've created 3 journal entries back in November of last year for my 3 employees. Let's take a look at employee 1 for an example. I'm going to edit the journal entry so we can take a look. In this case, employee 1 has a salary of $4,000. But my business must pay $500 of FICA, $100 of unemployment, $70 of medical insurance, $30 of workman's comp, and I have a matching 401k for which I paid $300. Of course, all of these numbers are fictional, just using them as an example. So between the salary, my payroll expense accounts, and the amount that I am putting into the 401k for employee 1, my total burden of payroll for employee 1 is $5,000. So I enter a $5,000 credit on my checking account. A credit on a checking account will reduce it, and then I debit my salary account, I debit each of my expense accounts, and I debit my 401k. Since these are all expense accounts, debiting increases those accounts. So when I look at my my income statement, I will see that this journal entry has increased my salaries by $4,000, increased my FICA expense, unemployment, medical insurance, etc. So we have one credit to reduce the cash, and then each of our expense accounts and our optional 401k are debits. With all journal entries, the total credit must match the total debit as indicated in our net debits and credits. So, conceptually, not all of us are accountants. I'm not an accountant. But all we need to remember is credit the cash account and debit everything else, and it'll all balance out for us. Now, I've done this not only for employee 1, but I've done it for employee 2, who gets paid $3,000 with a net payroll burden of $35,000 and all of the payroll taxes and the 401k, and the same for employee 3. That seems like a decent amount of work, even to me. So rather than individualizing each of my payroll expense accounts, I've decided, well, my payroll processing company already has that information for me. I don't need to input that into Design Manager. If my accountant, or if I ever need to go back and review each of those accounts, I could do so with all of the robust reporting that most payroll processing companies provide. In fact, Paychex has a wonderful report called the Cash Requirements Report that would list this out for me. So I can simplify my data entry very simple to a good degree. So let's take a look at the December 2013 entries, where I've decided I don't necessarily need to break down all those expense accounts because I know I have that information with my payroll company. I've decided to unify all my expense accounts for payroll taxes into one. So rather than having an account for local, FICA, unemployment, etc., I made a single expense account, $61,900, for payroll taxes. With a flick of a wrist, I can go to my Paychex Cash Requirements Report and see exactly what's on that $700 if myself or my accounting professional requires the individual breakdown of those. So rather than having 5 different expense accounts here, I simply have one. Everything else is the same. My salary is still $4,000. My 401k is still $300. I still have a total still payroll burden for employee 1 of $5,000, but I've simplified my data entry in half for each employee by using one expense account. Further, as I keep entering all my journal entries, I realize, well, I have all of the information for all of my employees with my Paychex or my payroll processing company. I don't need to make individual journal entries for each one. I could make one journal entry that represents the entire payroll period in one journal entry. So at the beginning of this year, I tried to get a little bit more creative on my data entry. So now, I took the sum of all of my salaries for employee 1, 2, and 3 of $10,000, all of my payroll taxes, the total amount that I've matched in my 401k, and the exact amount that's being withdrawn from my banking institution. All of the detail of this information can be retrieved from any reputable payroll processing company or your accounting professional or the payroll processing program you're using. It's already there. Design Manager now is just reflecting the transactions you recorded with that third party. So all you need to do is create a single journal entry with those 4 accounts, and perhaps even 3 if you don't have the 401 matching expense account, and be done per pay period. So looking at these 3 methods of the journal entries, what are the pros and cons? Well, the first method, where we made a single journal entry for each employee and broke down each expense account, has the most detail and is the most representative of the actual transactions that occurred with the third-party payroll processing company. So each of our accounts match exactly what happened in that third party. So I can go to Design Manager at any time and see my total unemployment expense. I can see my total unemployment expense for a given employee if I code my journal entries properly. So I have a ton of information that is from the payroll processing company encompass entirely in Design Manager, so I can review that as necessary without having to go into different programs or into different information areas. The con is it's a lot of extra work. I need to make a single journal entry for each employee and do all of my accounts. So my payroll processing each period has the most data entry and the most of my valuable time. Well, our second option, whereby I unify my payroll taxes but still create a journal entry for each employee, well, that speeds up my data entry to at least half or the amount of time as the first example. But I'm still creating individual entries for each employee. And if I have 10, 12, 15 employees, it's going to be a big burden of my time on the 15th and the end of the month, or whatever my pay period might be. But I can still take a look at my journal entries and see the particular effect that employee 1 might have on my salary account. And I can see how much 401k that I have done for each of my employees. And I can break down my total burden of employment for each of the employees. So I do have additional information within Design Manager that does match my payroll processing company, and if I need to break down those payroll taxes, I know that I can simply open up my appropriate documentation with that company and get that breakdown. The third method, and if I might speak frankly, is my preferred method, being knowing how valuable all of our time is the single journal entry to represent all of our employees and unify our taxes. What's the benefit here? Well, clearly it's speed of entry. One journal entry for each pay period, I'm done. And I know that I can still go to my Paychecks Cash Requirements report or all of my documentation from my other payroll processing services and see all the detail that I need. I don't need to replicate that in Design Manager because it's very infrequent that I'm going to be needing to go to that information, except for perhaps at tax time when I just send it all off to the accountant anyway. So this makes it very, very quick and easy to record that information for me. Now, that being said, there's a few extra pieces of information on the journal entry side that I'd like to point out. One, when creating a journal entry, in Design Manager, you see this Paychecks button down here. And also in our professional platform, we can see the Import PR button. Now, Design Manager has partnered with Paychecks in that if you're subscribed to their service, they have a function called their General Reporting Service, and this outputs a data file. So not only am I alleviating my burden of getting a third party, finding the proper third party system to handle my payroll, or heaven forbid, doing all the deductions and withholdings myself, I can use Paycheck's very reasonable service, go onto their general ledger reporting file, and I can import that information right into Design Manager. And what that does is it actually makes these journal entries for me. In the professional platform, you can select it to make a single journal entry, as we described in our final example, or in the professional platform, you can have it make a journal entry for each employee. Design Manager only has the option to import each one as a single journal entry for the entire company, again, which is my preferred method. So we have used Paychecks at Design Manager to handle all of our payroll. We found them to be extremely reasonable and partnered with them to help our clients use that service. If you do use the service, it's very convenient to use the General Ledger reporting services and import that right into Design Manager. So I wanted to point that out as we are coming to the conclusion here. So with that being said, final entry here. On our professional platform, there is an additional handy feature. There's our payroll import. We also have a feature on the professional that says recurring here. This is a recurring journal entry. Now, I know that I use a single journal entry to record all of my payroll. So even if I don't have the paychecks import, I could create a recurring journal entry. In this case, all of my employees are salary and my tax burden, my payroll burden is the same every pay period. I can configure the recurring journal entry and simply import that each pay period and just post. So the professional has another layer of creating a, let's call it a holding area for our journal entries. And as long as if my payroll burden is consistent each pay period, or even if it's not, I can still configure it and make the adjustments as necessary, but I have that payroll template stored for my use each time. And again, that's in the professional platform. So, to conclude the discussion today on our payroll entries in Design Manager, there's two ways to do it. You can use the Design Manager payroll entry system, where we have our accounts and our employees pre-configured, and we actually create these specialized payroll entries and can even print a special payroll check to each employee. And then we can use our journal entry method, whereby we do have some third-party payroll processing service that provides us with the information of what happened, and we use our journal entries to get that information into Design Manager very quickly and accurately. So that brings us to the end of the webinar today, and I'll be happy to handle any questions that might have come up, Liz.
Hey, Brad. We don't have any questions right now, so I think we're good.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. That was a very, hopefully that was a very effective demonstration and discussion on handling payroll in Design Manager. I'm glad everyone came out, and hope you got some good information today, and I'll turn it back over to Liz.
Thanks, Brad, and thank you for everyone who attended the webinar today. We are going to end things here, but we do invite you to email support@designmanager.com with any other questions you have about the software. We hope you enjoyed everything, and we hope you have a great day. And feel free to visit our website at www.designmanager.com, as we do have webinars every Thursday. Thank you, and have a good day.